April 1942. General George Marshall walked into 10 Downing Street, carrying a briefcase full of plans that would decide the future of World War II. Inside those documents was Operation Roundup, a massive cross-channel invasion of France. 48 divisions. Spring 1943. The most direct route to Berlin. The fastest way to end the war. Winston Churchill sat across from him, cigar smoke curling toward the ceiling. The Prime Minister listened politely. He nodded at appropriate moments. He asked thoughtful questions. When Marshall finished his presentation, Churchill told him it was brilliant, bold, exactly what the Allies needed. The British Chiefs of Staff agreed completely. They would support the plan with full commitment. Marshall flew back to Washington believing he had won. He hadn't. Churchill had no intention of launching a cross-channel invasion in 1943. He had no intention of launching one in 1942. The agreement was theater, a performance designed to keep America focused on Germany instead of Japan. One historian later explained it perfectly. Churchill's agreement came only because of his conviction that the plan was impossible to implement. Marshall would spend the next 2 years fighting the same battle over and over. Every conference, every meeting, every strategic discussion. He would push for a direct assault across the English Channel. Churchill would propose alternatives. The Mediterranean, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, the Balkans, Norway, anywhere but France. The debate between Marshall and Churchill over invasion strategy wasn't just about military tactics. It was about two completely different ways of understanding war. And the outcome would determine when World War II ended, how many people died, and who controlled Europe when the fighting stopped. The roots of Marshall's strategy went back to December 1941. Japan had just attacked Pearl Harbor. America was in the war. Roosevelt and Churchill met at the Arcadia Conference in Washington to establish Allied strategy. They agreed on Germany first. Defeat Hitler before dealing with Japan. But how? Marshall was convinced from the first that American forces should be sent as quickly as possible to the British Isles in preparation for early cross-channel operations. His logic was simple and brutal. Geography favored a direct attack. The shortest distance from Allied bases to German industrial heartland ran through northern France. Roads existed. Ports existed. Terrain supported mechanized warfare. Every other approach was longer, more difficult, and less decisive. The motivation for direct assault was primarily to relieve pressure on the Soviets on the Eastern Front. By 1942, the Red Army was bleeding out fighting the Wehrmacht. The United States would suffer approximately 405,000 uniform deaths during World War II. The British lost over 700,000. The Soviet death toll was 26 million. The numbers were staggering. Up until D-Day, the Red Army inflicted 93% of all German combat casualties. Stalin was desperate for relief. He had been pressing for a second front since June 1941. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, every month the Allies delayed was another month the Red Army fought alone. Another month of Soviet soldiers dying by the hundreds of thousands. Stalin made it clear. Open a second front in Western Europe where the Soviet Union might collapse. Or worse, might negotiate a separate peace with Germany. If that happened, the Wehrmacht could turn its full strength west. Invasion would become impossible. Marshall and his staff planners, led by then-unknown Brigadier General Dwight Eisenhower, devised a three-part plan using British code names. Bolero, the buildup of Anglo-American forces in the United Kingdom. Roundup, a spring 1943 cross-channel invasion of 48 Allied divisions. And Sledgehammer, a contingency alternative cross-channel invasion in 1942. Eisenhower, working in the War Plans Division, had framed the proposals quickly. He understood what Marshall understood. With control of the seas assured, both Eisenhower and Marshall were convinced that Anglo-American forces could cross the channel as soon as air supremacy could be obtained in the landing area. The key was concentration of force. Build up overwhelming strength in England. Train. Prepare. Then strike directly at Germany's throat. The plan arrived on Roosevelt's desk in March 1942. He approved it immediately. Marshall flew to London in April with Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's personal envoy. They met with Churchill and the British Chiefs of Staff. On April 12, 1942, Churchill telegraphed Roosevelt, "I am in entire agreement with all that you propose, and so are the Chiefs of Staff." In actuality, the British did not have the slightest intention of going along with the plan. The British had reasons for their reluctance. Terrible reasons. Reasons written in blood across French battlefields from World War I. Churchill had served in that war. He had watched British soldiers die by the hundreds of thousands in offensives that gained nothing. The Somme, Passchendaele, names that haunted British military thinking. During Marshall's final attempts to persuade Churchill to accept the Roundup plan, one of Churchill's closest advisors remarked, "It's no use. You are arguing against the casualties on the Somme." Churchill employed an array of fatalistic imagery to argue against an early cross-channel invasion, warning Roosevelt at one point that the result of such a strategy would be a channel full of corpses. The Prime Minister remembered Gallipoli. He remembered Dieppe. He knew how quickly amphibious operations could go catastrophically wrong. He wasn't going to send British troops into another slaughter. But there was more to British reluctance than fear of casualties. By 1942, Britain had been fighting for 3 years. They were exhausted. Their army had been driven from France at Dunkirk. They had lost Singapore. They had lost Tobruk. Recent operations had revealed weaknesses that terrified British leadership. The disasters, along with the failure of every British desert offensive undertaken against the Afrika Korps, caused Churchill and the chiefs privately to question the competence of their own generals and the morale of their army. If the British doubted their own troops, what about the Americans? The United States Army in 1942 was massive but inexperienced. Millions of soldiers, almost none with combat experience. The naive Yankees had no idea of the difficulties involved in a large amphibious attack. Landing craft were scarce. Training was incomplete. Equipment was still arriving. The British looked at American forces and saw disaster waiting to happen. What Marshall didn't know in April 1942 was that he was about to lose the first battle in a war that would last 2 years. A war that would be fought in conference rooms instead of battlefields. A war that would determine when D-Day happened, how many people died, and whether Soviet armies would occupy all of Eastern Europe or just part of it. The outcome wasn't certain. And Marshall was about to discover just how good Churchill was at winning strategic arguments. June 1942. The British position in North Africa collapsed. Tobruk fell to Rommel. 33,000 British soldiers captured. It was a catastrophe. Churchill was in Washington when he received the news. He immediately saw the opportunity. The Americans wanted to invade France? How could they invade France when the British couldn't even hold North Africa? Churchill began promoting an alternative. Operation Torch, an invasion of French North Africa. It would secure the Mediterranean. It would protect British interests in Egypt and the Suez Canal. It would put American troops in action against Germans in 1942. Which Roosevelt desperately wanted for political reasons. The November elections were coming. Roosevelt needed to show American voters that their army was fighting. Marshall had first sought to cross the Channel with a small force in 1942, but could not, for lack of men and equipment. He knew Torch would delay everything. Marshall warned the Mediterranean was a blind alley, and this diversion of forces made a cross-channel invasion in 1943 practically impossible. Resources would flow to North Africa instead of England. Landing craft would be committed to the Mediterranean instead of being built for France. Troops would gain experience fighting in deserts instead of preparing for channel crossings. Marshall and Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, returned to London in July to save the plan. They failed. Squeezed between unyielding British opposition and presidential orders to reach an agreement, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff agreed to Operation Torch. It was one of the few times Roosevelt overruled his military chiefs. Politics had defeated strategy. Marshall had lost. Torch launched in November 1942. American troops landed in Morocco and Algeria. The French forces resisted briefly, then surrendered. It looked like a quick victory. Then, Hitler poured reinforcements into Tunisia. What was supposed to take weeks took months. The North Africa campaign didn't end until May 1943, 5 months longer than planned. The window for a 1943 cross-channel invasion was closing. January 1943. Roosevelt and Churchill met at Casablanca to plan the next phase. Marshall was determined to win the debate this time. He argued that military principle held that the best strategy involved a direct approach. The Mediterranean was just a diversion that would suck Allied resources like a vacuum pump. Churchill and his chiefs of staff insisted the Allies still weren't ready. Landing craft remained scarce. American troops needed more combat experience. German defenses along the French coast were formidable. It made more sense to continue in the Mediterranean. Sicily was right there. Italy was vulnerable. Mussolini's regime was weak. One more push might knock Italy out of the war entirely. As they debated the issue, divisions among the American chiefs of staff weakened their position. Although Marshall insisted on a cross-channel invasion later that year, Admiral Ernest King wanted more resources for the Pacific theater, while American air chiefs began to argue that air power alone could bring about Germany's defeat. The Americans weren't united. Churchill exploited that division masterfully. Roosevelt compromised again. Sicily would be invaded. Italy would follow. The cross-channel assault was postponed to 1944. Marshall had lost again. Stalin was furious. He had been promised a second front. Now he was being told to wait another year while the Western Allies fought in Italy. Marshall's prediction that the Mediterranean theater would draw in resources and delay the cross-channel attack was borne out. Sicily fell in July 1943. Mussolini collapsed. Italy surrendered in September. But German forces poured into Italy and established defensive lines. What Churchill had promised would be quick exploitation turned into a grinding campaign. Allied forces became bogged down in Italian mountains. The soft underbelly of Europe was proving anything but soft. August 1943. The Quadrant Conference in Quebec. Marshall played his most powerful trump. Unless the British gave Overlord priority, the Americans would shift from the existing Germany First strategy to a Japan First strategy. It was a threat. A serious one. If the British wouldn't commit to France, American resources would flow to the Pacific. The war against Germany would become secondary. Churchill backed down. Finally, Overlord was scheduled for May 1944. An American would command. The invasion was official, but Churchill hadn't given up. Not really. Over the next months, he continued proposing alternatives. The Dodecanese Islands, the Balkans, Norway. Anything to delay or avoid the direct assault, Marshall insisted on. November 1943. The Tehran Conference. The first meeting of the Big Three. Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt together. Stalin immediately pressed the issue. Where was the second front? When would it happen? He was blunt, angry, and suspicious. The Soviet Union had been fighting for 2.5 years. Soviet soldiers were dying every day. The Western Allies were still debating strategy. At Tehran, the Allies finally agreed to an Overlord launch date sometime in May 1944 and a supporting operation in the south of France. Churchill couldn't deflect anymore. Stalin pinned him down. Roosevelt backed the Americans. Overlord was confirmed. The commander would be named soon. Marshall expected to command the invasion. Everyone expected it. General George Marshall was the early favorite for the job. Marshall had pushed for a European invasion since 1942 and impressed planners with his strategic vision. He had fought for this operation for 2 years. It was his plan, his strategy, his vision. Roosevelt picked General Dwight Eisenhower instead. The president thought Marshall was too valuable as Army Chief of Staff to move. Roosevelt told Marshall he couldn't sleep at night with Marshall out of Washington. The decision was final. Eisenhower would command Overlord. Marshall would stay in Washington. It was a bitter disappointment. Marshall never said so publicly, but everyone knew. He had spent 2 years pushing for this invasion, fighting Churchill at every conference, defending the strategy against critics. And when it finally happened, someone else would lead it. But Marshall's consolation was more significant than any command. The invasion was happening on his timeline, using his strategy. A direct assault across the English Channel aimed at the German heartland. Not the peripheral campaigns Churchill wanted, not endless operations in the Mediterranean. The main event, the decisive blow. That was Marshall's victory. June 6, 1944. Allied forces landed at Normandy. The invasion fleet comprised 6,939 vessels, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 ancillary craft, and 864 merchant vessels. Nearly 160,000 troops hit the beaches. 5 divisions in the initial assault. British, American, and Canadian forces. The largest amphibious operation in history. It worked exactly as Marshall had envisioned. The invasion succeeded because Marshall had been right about the fundamentals. The direct approach worked. Northern France was the correct axis of advance. Concentration of force in England, then a massive strike across the Channel, achieved what peripheral operations in the Mediterranean never could. It opened the decisive front. It forced Germany to fight on 2 fronts simultaneously. It brought American industrial might directly into Germany's heartland. By August 30th, 1944, Allied forces had liberated Paris and crossed the Seine. They pushed through Belgium into the Netherlands. By winter, they were on Germany's border. 11 months after D-Day, Germany surrendered. The direct strategy Marshall had advocated in 1942 had proven correct. What if Churchill had won the strategic debate? What if the Allies had continued peripheral operations in the Mediterranean instead? Historians have debated this endlessly. Some argue the British were right to be cautious. The 1942 and 1943 invasions would have failed. The Allies needed time to build strength, gain experience, and develop proper tactics. Others point to a darker calculation. The German army in the West was weaker in the summer of 1943 than it was in mid-1944. While Germany's overall war production in 1944 was 50% greater than in 1943 and 126% greater than in 1942. Every month of delay made Germany stronger, built more tanks, produced more aircraft, strengthened coastal defenses. The Atlantic Wall in 1943 was incomplete. By 1944, it was formidable. Rommel had spent months improving it. The counterpoint is that ending the war a year earlier, even a month earlier, would have been a great service to humanity. Every month the war continued. Tens of thousands died. Soldiers, civilians, prisoners of war. The Holocaust continued. Cities were bombed. Resources were consumed. The human cost was incalculable. And there was another cost, one that became clear only after the war. Every month of delay gave the Soviet Union more time to advance westward. When the war finally ended, Soviet forces occupied Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. They would remain there for 45 years. If D-Day had happened in 1943, if Allied forces had reached Berlin sooner, The Iron Curtain might have fallen in a different place. Millions of people might have lived under democracy instead of Soviet occupation. Marshall understood this. Not the specific details, perhaps, but the strategic reality. Time favored Stalin. Every conference where Churchill proposed more Mediterranean operations was another conference where Soviet armies advanced west. Marshall wanted the cross-channel invasion to happen quickly, not just to defeat Germany, but to ensure Western forces reached Central Europe before the Soviets controlled everything. Marshall rejected all alternatives to a cross-channel attack and persevered at every opportunity for a straightforward assault on the French coast by an Allied army based in England. He did this knowing he would face opposition, knowing Churchill would propose alternatives, knowing he would lose battles and conferences. He did it anyway because he believed the direct approach was correct, not just militarily, but strategically and morally. The price of Churchill's caution was measured in months. Months of continued war, months of Soviet advance, months of Holocaust, months of bombing. The benefit was preparation, experience, strength, equipment. The 1944 invasion succeeded where a pig was for preparation, experience, strength, equipment. The 1944 invasion succeeded where a KGB war invasion succeeded where a 1943 invasion might have failed. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that Marshall's vision shaped the Allied victory. His insistence on a cross-channel invasion, his refusal to accept peripheral operations as the main strategy, his willingness to fight the same battle at conference after conference, all of it led to D-Day happening when and how it did. Marshall, U.S. Chief of Staff throughout World War II, convinced President Franklin Roosevelt that a cross-channel invasion was the shortest and cheapest route because it was the most direct route, a straight stab for the jugular. That phrase captures Marshall's entire philosophy. No clever maneuvers, no indirect approaches, no peripheral campaigns that looked attractive but accomplished nothing decisive. A straight stab for the jugular. Find the enemy's center of gravity and strike it with overwhelming force. Germany's center of gravity was its industrial heartland. The Ruhr, the factories producing tanks and aircraft, the transportation networks supplying armies. All of it was accessible through northern France. Every other approach was longer, more difficult, and less decisive. Marshall saw this clearly in 1942. He never wavered. Churchill saw something different. He saw British and American soldiers drowning in the English Channel. He saw beaches covered with bodies. He saw another Somme, another Passchendaele, another disaster that would destroy armies and accomplish nothing. His caution was earned. His fears were legitimate. But his strategy was wrong. After the war, assessments were made. What worked? What didn't? What lessons should guide future operations? The verdict on Marshall's strategy was clear. The direct approach had been correct. American, British, and Canadian troops fought their way ashore on the Normandy beaches, June 6, 1944, across France and Belgium and into Germany, ending the war in Europe 11 months later. 11 months. That was the timeline from Normandy to Berlin. 11 months to defeat what had been the most powerful military force in Europe. It worked because Marshall had been right about concentration of force, about the importance of the direct approach, about striking at Germany's center of gravity. The Mediterranean campaigns had value. They knocked Italy out of the war. They tied down German divisions. They gave Allied forces combat experience, but they didn't win the war. They couldn't win the war. Only a direct assault across the Channel could do that. Marshall understood this from the beginning. He spent 2 years convincing everyone else. His legacy isn't just that he was right. It's that he was willing to fight for what he believed despite overwhelming opposition. Churchill was one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century. Brilliant, persuasive, politically savvy. He dominated conferences. He won arguments. He got his way more often than not. But Marshall didn't back down. He kept pushing, kept arguing, kept insisting the direct approach was correct. At the Tehran Conference, as the Big Three finally committed to Overlord, Stalin raised a toast. To Marshall, he said, who had made the invasion possible, who had pushed for it when others wanted to delay, who had seen clearly what needed to be done and refused to accept alternatives. It was a remarkable acknowledgement from a man who rarely praised Western leaders. Marshall deflected the praise. He always did. He wasn't interested in credit. He was interested in results. D-Day was the result. 11 months later, Germany surrendered. That was the result. The war ended sooner than it would have if Churchill's peripheral strategy had continued. That was the result. The cost was measured in lives saved, in months subtracted from the war, in territory not occupied by Soviet armies, in concentration camps liberated sooner, in cities not bombed for another year. None of this was certain in 1942 when Marshall first proposed Roundup, but Marshall believed in the direct approach. He believed in concentration of force. He believed in striking decisively at the enemy's center of gravity. It was Marshall who, day in and day out, kept hammering away at the cross-channel concept. He knew that was the quickest way to get at the main German power. Every conference, every meeting, every strategic discussion, Marshall pushed for the same thing, a direct assault across the English Channel, aimed at Germany's heart, using overwhelming force, creating the decisive second front that would split German armies and end the war. He got it, 2 years later than he wanted, after countless arguments and conferences, after watching resources flow to the Mediterranean when they should have gone to England, after seeing the timeline slip from 1942 to 1943 to 1944. But he got it. And when it happened, it worked exactly as he said it would. June 6, 1944, was Marshall's victory as much as it was Eisenhower's or any field commander's. The strategy was his. The insistence on the direct approach was his. The refusal to accept Churchill's alternatives was his. Without Marshall's 2-year fight for the cross-channel invasion, D-Day might have happened in 1945, or later. Or perhaps not at all if Churchill's peripheral strategy had continued indefinitely. The war in Europe ended May 8, 1945, 11 months after Normandy, 2 years after Marshall first proposed Roundup. The delay cost lives, it cost territory, it cost time. But the strategy itself was vindicated. The direct approach worked. The cross-channel invasion worked. Marshall had been right from the beginning, and his insistence on that strategy, despite 2 years of opposition, reshaped how America won World War II.